My parents banned me from Grandma's deathbed. She left them a will and me a trust. The cold, sterile hum of the hospital waiting room's fluorescent lights burrowed into my skull long before Mom's text pinged across my phone screen. Sharp and unforgiving, every capital letter a slap straight to my chest. Do not come to the hospital. Grandma's condition is critical. We don't want you upsetting her in her final hours. I stared at the words until my vision blurred, knuckles white around the cracked glass of my smartphone, parked outside the downtown medical center's emergency drop-off ramp, with my engine idling soft against the damp October wind whipping through the open car window. I'd driven 45 minutes across 3 suburbs the second my distant aunt sent a panicked group chat message alerting the whole family Grandma's heart had given out overnight, her decades-long congestive heart failure finally spiraling into irreversible organ shutdown after a week of unresponsive sedation. I'd grabbed my worn wool coat, stuffed a crumpled old photograph of 12-year-old me curled on Grandma's porch swing into my jacket pocket, and raced out the door without grabbing breakfast, convinced I'd get to hold her gnarled, familiar hand one last time, whisper all the apologies I'd stored up over years of my parents forcing distance between me and the only adult who'd ever loved me unconditionally. Now I sat frozen behind the steering wheel, replaying every single cruel fight Mom and Dad had picked over my bond with Grandma stretching back to my teenage years. Every time they'd snapped that the elderly woman spoiled me rotten, and poisoned my mind against their authority, with quiet wisdom they refused to listen to. Grandma Eleanor had been 78, sharp-witted, self-made, a retired corporate attorney who'd built a 7-figure estate from scratch, after her husband died young, leaving her to raise my father alone, without a single dollar of family support. She'd never once hidden how she viewed my parents, entitled, petty, endlessly greedy for her money and status, desperate to leech off her hard-earned assets, while offering zero genuine care in return. When I was 16, I'd spent 3 straight weekends living at Grandma's lake cottage after Mom and Dad kicked me out for skipping their mandatory elite country club gala to attend Grandma's minor heart checkup, screaming that I valued a sick old woman over their social standing. Grandma had baked my favorite peach pie every night, let me sleep in her queen-sized guest bed lined with hand-stitched quilts she'd made as a girl, and sat me down at her oak dining table to lay out plain truth I'd been too young to fully grasp back then. Your mother and father only visit me when they need something, new luxury cars, down payments for their second vacation home, free private school tuition handouts for your cousin, the useless boy they fawn over like he's a crown prince. They resent how I see right through their performative love, and they hate that I love you more than I ever could love their shallow, transactional version of family. Back then I'd brushed her words off as bitter loneliness, convinced blood would override their greed eventually, that Mom and Dad would soften as Grandma's health faded and they remembered to cherish their own mother instead of fixating on her portfolio. That delusion shattered completely 10 minutes after I pulled up to the hospital, when Dad stepped out of the glass front sliding doors, spotted my sedan, and stormed across the wet concrete parking lot toward my car, face twisted red with unbridled fury, rain droplets streaking his overpriced designer blazer he'd only pulled out for Grandma's hospital visits to impress the hospital's wealthy donor board members he begged for business referrals. He slammed his palm flat against my driver's side window hard enough to rattle the glass, his voice raised loud enough to draw sideways stares from nurses and grief-stricken families shuffling in and out of the lobby behind him. I texted your mother to tell you to turn this car around and drive home immediately, Lila, he snarled, nostrils flaring, jaw tight with the same unbridled resentment he'd carried for me every time I chose Grandma's quiet company over their flashy social events. This is no place for you right now. Eleanor's breathing is shallow, her brain can barely register voices, and every time you walk into a room you start some dramatic argument with us about how we supposedly mistreat you. We won't risk sending her heart rate spiking in her final minutes, just to satisfy your selfish need for a tearful goodbye scene you've romanticized in your head. I cranked the window down an inch, cold autumn air rushing into the car to sting my tear-pricked cheeks, the old photograph of us on the swing digging sharp into my palm through my coat pocket. She's my grandma too, Dad. I've visited her every single month without fail for 8 years straight, even when you two banned me from stepping foot in your house for months on end just because she gave me a graduation gift you thought was too expensive. You show up once every 2 weeks only to beg her for investment loans for your failing landscaping business, and you get to sit by her deathbed while I'm locked out in a parking lot. A bitter, mocking laugh burst out of him, harsh and hollow over the wind's howl through the parking lot light poles. Selfish as always. You think Eleanor's last wish is to see her ungrateful, rebellious granddaughter, who refuses to follow our rules. She's been begging us to keep you away for weeks. Said your constant complaining about our parenting stresses her out worse than her heart meds. Go back to your tiny downtown studio apartment, wallow alone like you always do, and don't even think about showing up for the funeral visitation tomorrow either. We've already told the funeral home to cross your name off the guest list entirely. The words landed like a heavy brick straight to my ribs, every ounce of fragile hope I'd clung to dissolving into cold rain-soaked despair. I'd spent hundreds of hours over the last 2 years sitting with Grandma while Mom and Dad skipped her hospital stays to attend golf tournaments and wine tastings, read her legal case files when her eyesight grew too weak to parse fine print, bathed her feet when arthritis left her unable to bend down, held her through panic attacks brought on by loneliness when Dad only called to demand cash transfers over the phone. I'd thought those quiet, tender moments meant something, that she'd made it clear to her only son how much I meant to her, that he'd set aside his petty grudges long enough to let me say goodbye. Clearly I'd misjudged the depth of his avarice, the way every dollar Grandma owned blinded him to any shred of familial loyalty toward his own daughter. She never asked you to keep me away, I said, voice cracking thin beneath the weight of suppressed sobs threatening to spill out of my throat. You're lying to get rid of me so you too can hover over her bedside and manipulate her into rewriting her will one last time before she passes. You've been hounding her for months to shift all her lake property and stock holdings over to your joint accounts, remember? She told me last month she'd already locked her final estate documents away with her private attorney, said she wouldn't let you two bully her out of the assets she spent 50 years building. Dad's face drained of all color for half a second, the rage flickering out to cold panic before he masked it behind another scowl, shoving a finger directly in my face through the cracked car window. That's none of your business. Eleanor's will is family business, yours doesn't extend a single cent of what she's leaving us. Now move this car before I call hospital security to tow it and have trespassing charges filed against you for loitering on private medical property. Without waiting for a single retort from me, he spun on his heel and marched back inside the hospital's glass lobby, slamming the heavy entry door shut behind him hard enough to echo across the empty parking bays surrounding my sedan. I sat alone for 40 minutes, watching hospital staff wheel gurneys in and out of the emergency wing, clutching the faded swing photo so tight the paper creased and tore along the edge. Silent tears streaming down my jaw to drip onto my steering wheel and stain the leather black beneath my fingers. I'd never felt more invisible, more disposable in my own blood family than I did in that damp parking lot, barred from the woman who'd raised me when my parents couldn't be bothered to care. Shut out by two people who'd only ever seen Grandma as a walking bank account rather than a living, breathing human being who'd loved me fiercely all my life. Eventually my phone buzzed again, a short text from my maternal Aunt Clara, the only relative outside Grandma's circle who'd ever been halfway honest with me. They just called the palliative care team in. Eleanor's heart stopped 10 minutes ago. Your parents wouldn't let me sneak you back there even when I begged them, said you'd ruin their inheritance moment, before the estate lawyer arrives tomorrow morning to read the will aloud at Grandma's lake house. My chest caved inward entirely at the message, a sharp, hollow grief overtaking every muscle in my body as I twisted the car key and peeled out of the medical center parking lot, tires squealing against wet asphalt as I headed back toward my cramped downtown studio, the 45-minute drive stretching into an endless blur of gray highway overpasses and rain-slick streetlights blurring through my tear-streaked windshield. I didn't bother turning on the lights when I stumbled through my apartment front door hours later, dropping my soaked coat onto the linoleum entry floor and collapsing onto my threadbare second-hand couch, the torn photograph of Grandma and me still crumpled tight in my fist. All night I lay awake replaying every memory we'd shared. Summer mornings picking wild strawberries in her backyard garden, her teaching me how to draft simple legal contracts when I was only 10, her holding me after Mom disowned me for dating a partner my parents deemed not wealthy enough, her quiet promise whispered into my hair last spring when her heart flared up badly. Don't let them bully you out of what's yours when I'm gone. I've protected you, baby girl. I spent every night for the next 3 days trapped in a fog of unprocessed grief and simmering resentment, skipping meals, ignoring non-stop text spam from Mom, blowing up my phone to threaten legal action if I dared crash Grandma's public funeral service held at the upscale downtown country club my parents worshipped. They'd booked the venue using Grandma's prepaid funeral fund, flown in a catered 5-course meal for all their wealthy business associates, handed out glossy printed funeral programs that featured full-page photographs of Mom, Dad, and my spoiled male cousin Jax. Zero single image of me anywhere on the pages, not a single line acknowledging I existed as Eleanor's granddaughter at all. I'd debated sneaking into the back of the funeral chapel, just to stand in the far corner and say my quiet goodbyes, but Aunt Clara sent a frantic warning Saturday morning. Your dad hired 2 private security guards posted at every entryway, told them to physically escort you off the premises the second they spot your face. He's terrified you'll stand up in front of all their rich friends and mention how they banned you from her deathbed before the will reading tomorrow. I sank back onto my couch after reading that message, swallowing the bitter lump in my throat, pouring a glass of lukewarm tap water to wash down the headache pills I'd been popping non-stop to dull the throbbing behind my temples. They weren't just excluding me out of petty teenage grudges anymore. They were guarding Grandma's estate like rabid dogs, convinced every single penny of her 7-figure fortune belonged solely to their little nuclear unit, writing me entirely out of her legacy as punishment for daring to prioritize her well-being over their endless greed over the years. The day scheduled for the formal will reading arrived cold and bright, crisp autumn sunlight filtering through my apartment windows as I pulled on a plain black blazer and grabbed the handwritten note Grandma had slipped into my purse last time I visited her cottage, sealed inside a cream envelope embossed with her personal attorney's firm logo. She'd told me the sealed letter contained instructions to hand to the lawyer the second the estate proceedings opened, said it would explain the separate asset she'd created specifically for me apart from the primary will drafted to cover Mom and Dad's joint inheritance. I'd barely driven 10 minutes toward Grandma's lake house address when my cell phone lit up with an incoming call from Dad, his tone venomous the second I accepted the line. If you so much as pull into the gravel driveway of Eleanor's cottage today, I'll have local sheriff deputies remove you for trespassing before you can step foot out of your car. He spat down the receiver, no trace of remorse for locking me out of my grandmother's final hours weighing in his voice whatsoever. This is immediate family only for the will review. You forfeited any right to be here the day you chose to disrespect us, by siding with a senile old woman who couldn't even tell her own assets apart by the end. She wasn't senile, I shot back, gripping the steering wheel tight enough my knuckles whitened beneath the fabric of my blazer sleeves. Her cognitive tests came back crystal clear 3 weeks before she passed. The hospital paperwork is sitting in her cottage home office for your lawyer to review today. She knew exactly what she was signing when she finalized all her estate documents, and she knew full well how you two treated me while she was dying. Dad scoffed loud on the other end of the call, the sound sharp and dismissive. Her judgment was clouded by guilt over spoiling you your whole life. The primary will leaves the lake house, all her stock portfolios, rental commercial buildings, and every piece of antique jewelry to your mother and me outright, no strings attached. There's nothing here for you, so save yourself the embarrassment of driving all the way out here just to get rejected at the front door. He hung up abruptly mid-sentence, cutting the dial tone blaring loud in my ear as I stared ahead at the 2-lane rural highway winding toward Grandma's wooded lake property. A quiet, stubborn resolve settled heavy in my chest as I pressed harder on the gas pedal, refusing to turn my car around and slink back to my empty apartment. Grandma had promised she'd protected me, and I wasn't about to skip the will reading just because my father threw empty sheriff threats around to scare me off. When I rounded the bend leading to her cottage's long gravel driveway, 2 large black SUVs, belonging to Dad's business associates, sat parked beside Mom's luxury SUV. A uniformed private security guard loitering by the front porch steps exactly as Aunt Clara had warned he would be. I parked my sedan on the far edge of the driveway, well away from the other vehicles, grabbed the sealed lawyer's envelope from my glove compartment, and stepped out onto the crunchy stone path leading toward the oak front door of Grandma's cottage. The security guard stepped forward to block my path the second I drew within 10 feet of the porch railing, arms crossed firm across his broad chest. Mr. Hale instructed me to escort you off the premises immediately. No unauthorized guests permitted for the estate meeting today. I'm not an unauthorized guest, I told him, holding up the embossed cream envelope sealed with Grandma's personal wax stamp. I have a confidential letter for Attorney Mercer, drafted by Eleanor herself, required to be opened during the will reading proceedings. If you block me from entering, you're interfering with legal estate protocol, and your firm can face civil liability for obstructing a named beneficiary's access to mandatory court-supervised asset review. The guard hesitated, glancing down at the official wax seal glinting on the envelope flap, uncertain how to respond to the legal language I'd repeated from Grandma's prior explanations of her estate rules. Before he could make up his mind whether to step aside or call Dad out to physically remove me, Attorney Mercer himself pulled open the cottage's front door and stepped out onto the porch, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, the same attorney who'd handled Grandma's corporate cases for over 30 years. He spotted the sealed envelope in my grasp and nodded once at the security guard, a silent command to stand down and clear the walkway for me to pass through. Ms. Hale, please come inside. Mrs. Eleanor filed formal notification weeks ago that you would be present for today's proceedings, regardless of your parents' verbal objections to your attendance. The guard stepped back reluctantly, glaring at me as I brushed past him and crossed the wooden porch threshold into Grandma's sunlit cottage great room, every surface lined with the hand-carved furniture and family photos she'd collected over 78 years of life. Mom and Dad sat side by side on the oversized leather sectional couch positioned in front of the stone fireplace. My teenage cousin Jax slouched between them, scrolling mindlessly on an expensive new gaming tablet Grandma had purchased for him 6 months prior at Dad's relentless begging. The second they laid eyes on me stepping into the room, both my parents' faces twisted with unbridled rage, Mom shooting straight to her feet with a shrill, furious shriek bouncing off the cottage's vaulted wooden ceilings. How dare you ignore every single warning we sent you? We told you this was private, immediate family business. You had zero right to barge in here and disrupt Eleanor's legal will process after you upset her so badly in her final months. Attorney Mercer held up a single hand to cut Mom's screaming tirade off mid-sentence, setting a thick leather-bound legal binder down atop Grandma's oak dining table centered in the middle of the room, every page inside filled with printed estate documents, asset spreadsheets, and formal witness statements Eleanor had signed in front of notary publics over the last year. Before we proceed with the primary last will and testament drafted by Mrs. Eleanor Hale, we will first review the sealed confidential correspondence she requested I open the moment her surviving granddaughter Lila arrived at this property today. He reached out to take the wax-stamped envelope I handed over to him, sliding a thin silver letter opener along the folded flap to slice the wax clean open, unfolding Grandma's handwritten cursive letter across the cream stationery paper, and reading every word aloud for everyone seated in the room to hear without skipping a single line. To my attorney, and to my son Robert and his wife Margaret, if this letter is read aloud during my estate review, I make no apologies for the boundaries I set in my final asset distribution. For 16 months leading up to my passing, Robert and Margaret repeatedly pressured me to rewrite my primary will to remove all protective provisions I'd put in place for my granddaughter Lila, threatened to cut off all personal contact between me and the child if I refused to sign over my lake property and investment portfolios to their joint marital bank accounts. They banned Lila from my hospital deathbed 3 days prior to my cardiac arrest, deliberately barred her from my funeral visitation, and spent every single visit to my medical facilities solely to beg for large cash handouts rather than offer genuine emotional care during my prolonged heart illness. Every time Lila sat with me through sleepless hospital nights, bathed my arthritic limbs, read my legal filings when my vision faded, and brought my favorite homemade peach pie to my cottage without being prompted, Robert and Margaret mocked her for currying favor to steal my money, despite Lila never once asking me for a single dollar of my wealth in the 24 years of her life. I created 2 separate legal vehicles for my assets prior to finalizing my primary will. The first, my formal last will and testament, allocates the residential lake cottage, all publicly traded stock holdings, my downtown commercial rental buildings, antique fine jewelry collection, and all liquid savings within my primary checking and investment accounts to my son Robert and his wife Margaret, with the stipulation that 50% of all annual rental and dividend profits generated from these assets must be set aside in a college education fund for their son Jax. This is the only portion of my estate they will receive, and I do not expect them to share any of these funds with Lila voluntarily after I am gone. The second asset vehicle I established, fully separate from the will they will hear moments from now, is an irrevocable private trust created exclusively for Lila Marie Hale, established 5 years ago through a separate offshore brokerage firm none of my immediate family have any knowledge of until this letter is disclosed today. The trust contains no property listed within the primary will, and cannot be seized, contested, or legally challenged by Robert, Margaret, or any third-party family members under any state civil or probate statutes. Within this trust one have deposited a total of $1.97 million in untraceable municipal bond investments, a fully paid-off luxury downtown condo 3 blocks from Lila's current studio apartment, a portfolio of private small business equity shares I acquired independently outside my corporate law career, and a vintage sports car I purchased and registered solely under the trust's legal LLC last spring. The trust's sole designated trustee is Attorney Mercer, with full authority to disburse monthly living stipends, cover all Lila's healthcare and education costs, and transfer full legal ownership of the condo and vehicle to her on her 25th birthday next year. Robert and Margaret will never gain access to any bank records, asset titles, or investment paperwork linked to this trust, as I intentionally shielded all its existence from them over every family dinner and hospital visit they attended to beg for money. I write this letter to make one fact explicitly clear to my son and daughter-in-law. I knew you would lock Lila away from my final moments out of petty greed and fear she would inherit a portion of my fortune. So I split my estate entirely to ensure her security would never rely on your mercy or generosity after I draw my last breath. You may take the house, the stocks, and the jewelry you've spent years coveting, but you will never strip Lila of the safety I spent decades building for the only person in this bloodline who ever loved me without demanding a financial reward in return. Signed, Eleanor Hale, dated 6 weeks prior to my cardiac hospital admission, witnessed and notarized. The silence that crashed over Grandma's cottage living room after Attorney Mercer finished reading the letter out loud was deafening, thick enough to cut with a kitchen knife. Mom's mouth fell open wide, her face draining of all color, as she stared blankly at the attorney holding Grandma's handwritten note, every ounce of smug triumph she'd carried into the room vanishing in an instant, replaced by blind, seething rage. Dad shot straight up off the leather sectional couch, marching across the oak floorboards toward Attorney Mercer with fists clenched tight at his sides, voice raised to a thunderous shout that shook the cottage's wooden rafters overhead. That's fraudulent fabrication. She never had the mental capacity to set up a secret trust behind our backs. Her heart medication clouded her judgment, and this letter's nothing more than a biased lie she wrote while Lila manipulated her against us day in and day out. Attorney Mercer folded Grandma's letter neatly and tucked it back inside the wax-sealed envelope, placing it into a locked leather legal briefcase at his feet before sliding the thick primary will binder across the dining table toward my parents for them to review page by page. All medical cognitive assessments completed on Mrs. Hale within 90 days of this letter's signing confirm full legal mental competency at the time of drafting the trust and correspondence. Every financial document tied to Lila's irrevocable trust is filed with the state probate court as a protected separate asset outside this primary will's jurisdiction, meaning you two have zero legal standing to file contest claims against its holdings. Irrevocable trusts cannot be overturned through civil probate litigation, regardless of your personal grievances toward your daughter. Jax, my 16-year-old cousin who'd never lifted a finger to visit Grandma a single time while she was hospitalized, finally looked up from his gaming tablet, a whiny, entitled scowl twisting his youthful features, as he gestured toward me where I stood quiet beside the fireplace mantel lined with Grandma's framed photographs. That's not fair. Grandma always said all her stuff was supposed to be mine for college, and a new sports car. Why does Lila get almost $2 million, and a fancy condo, just for moping around her all the time? Mom rounded on Jax instantly, shushing him sharp, before turning back to level a venomous glare directly at me, every ounce of maternal affection she'd ever pretended to have for me evaporating completely from her expression. You planned this entire scheme from the very start, didn't you? You spent years cozying up to Eleanor, whispering lies about us into her ear to turn her against her own son and daughter-in-law, all just so she'd hand you a hidden fortune we never knew existed. You deliberately pushed her to ban us from her private trust paperwork, and you even forced her to lock us out of her final hours, so we couldn't talk her out of this absurd arrangement before she passed away. I let out a quiet, hollow laugh at her baseless accusation, glancing around the cottage at every framed photograph lined along the mantel that featured only Grandma and me, summer lake trips, holiday baking sessions, quiet evenings reading legal textbooks side by side, none of which included Mom, Dad, or Jax anywhere in the frames. I never once asked Grandma for a single dollar, not a rent handout, not a car down payment, not tuition assistance, not a piece of her expensive jewelry. Every single time she offered to gift me money, I turned it down, told her to save her assets for her own medical bills instead. You two are the ones who showed up every single week with a new request for cash, a $70,000 truck for Dad's landscaping business, a luxury beach condo down payment for your summer vacations, a brand new gaming PC for Jax that cost $12,000, endless charity gala donations to boost your social status in the country club crowd. She created that trust entirely on her own volition, because she watched how you treated me, how you barred me from her deathbed out of fear I'd stand witness to your greedy manipulation of her estate before she died. Dad slammed his palm down hard against the oak dining table, rattling every ceramic teacup Grandma had displayed atop the wooden surface, his face purpling with unbridled fury as he pointed a shaking finger straight at my chest. We will hire a team of high-profile probate litigators to dig up every loophole we can find to void that trust. There's no way an offshore LLC holding nearly $2 million in assets can remain shielded from our family's legal claims. We're her direct surviving son and heir, you're just her granddaughter. You have no greater right to her fortune than we do. Attorney Mercer shook his head slow and steady, sliding printed copies of the trust's founding legal documents across the table toward Mom and Dad to scan over line by line. Irrevocable inter vivos trusts operate outside standard probate court jurisdiction in this state. Mrs. Hale transferred full legal ownership of all trust assets 5 years prior to her passing, removing every single asset from her personal taxable estate permanently. No surviving family member, including her biological child, possesses legal grounds to file contest motions against its terms. Every witness who signed off on the trust's creation will testify under oath that Eleanor acted voluntarily, without coercion or manipulation from any outside party, including Lila, who repeatedly declined Grandma's monetary gifts for years on record. Mom snatched the stack of trust paperwork off the table and crumpled the printed pages tight in her fists, tossing the crumpled pile onto the wooden floor beside her feet in a fit of unhinged rage, tears of bitter frustration spilling down her cheeks, not out of grief for her own mother, but out of crippling jealousy over the separate fortune Grandma had secured exclusively for me. This is punishment, plain and simple. She's punishing us for raising you properly, for setting boundaries when you acted out as a teenager, for refusing to coddle your rebellious attitude toward our family's social rules. She chose to reward the ungrateful child, who turned her back on our family name, while shortchanging the son, who carried her last name his entire life. You never carried her last name, I corrected her flat, recalling the dozens of conversations Grandma had held with me about her bitter disappointment over Dad abandoning her maiden surname the second he married Mom to align with her wealthy side of the family's elite social circle. You dropped Hale entirely to take your wife's prestigious family moniker the day you two wed, refused to introduce her as your mother at any country club events for fear people would learn your mother was a self-made corporate attorney without generational old money lineage. She never got to be proud of her own son's public identity, because you spent decades distancing yourself from her humble working-class origins to impress Mom's affluent relatives. Dad's shoulders heaved with suppressed rage, his voice cracking thin as he fired off a litany of empty threats aimed straight at me. We will cut every single blood tie between us effective immediately. You are no longer our daughter, you will not receive a single invitation to any family holiday gathering moving forward, We will tell every friend and business associate we know that you manipulated your dying grandmother out of millions of dollars in a cruel elder financial abuse scheme. And we will file civil defamation lawsuits against you if you dare speak a word of this secret trust to any living soul outside this cottage today. I glanced over at Attorney Mercer for confirmation, and he nodded once to validate the legal weakness of their planned harassment campaign. Any false accusations of elder financial exploitation filed against Lila without verifiable evidence will result in counter-defamation claims. You too will be liable for substantial punitive damages over should you spread fabricated abuse rumors to your social and professional networks. Every hospital medical record, witness statement, and bank deposit slip proving Lila never accepted monetary handouts from Eleanor is filed within my firm's secure server to use in court if you proceed with slanderous public allegations. Mom and Dad ignored the attorney's legal warning entirely, too consumed by blind greed and humiliating resentment to pause and process the consequences of their planned smear campaign against me. They spent the next 2 hours combing through every page of Grandma's primary will, arguing viciously back and forth over how to split the lake cottage's furnishings and rental building profits between themselves and Jax, completely ignoring my presence standing quiet in the corner of the great room as they bickered over antique silverware sets and seasonal vacation rental revenue projections. Not once did either of them spare a single glance in my direction or acknowledge the nearly $2 million trust Grandma had left solely in my name, as if pretending the separate asset vehicle didn't exist would somehow erase its legal binding power over their bitter attempts to contest it in court. Once Attorney Mercer finished walking them through every clause of the primary will and scheduled a follow-up probate court hearing to finalize asset transfer timelines for the lake property and stock portfolios, he pulled me aside onto the cottage's private back porch, overlooking the glassy autumn lake stretching out behind the wooden deck railing, lowering his voice to a gentle, sympathetic tone reserved for grieving clients caught in toxic family inheritance wars. I knew Eleanor planned this trust years ago, but I was bound by attorney-client privilege to keep its existence confidential until her official estate proceedings opened today. She spent countless nights sitting in my office worrying about how Robert and Margaret would treat you once she passed, terrified they'd strip you of every ounce of stability if they held sole control over all her assets. Every monthly stipend from the trust will auto-deposit into a separate bank account only I have access to regulate until your 25th birthday next fall, when full title to the downtown condo and sports car transfers directly to your legal name without any third-party interference from your parents whatsoever. If they attempt to stalk, harass, or file frivolous civil lawsuits against you to target the trust's holdings, my firm will immediately file motion after motion to dismiss their baseless claims and pursue restraining orders against them for ongoing harassment. I stared out across the calm lake water Grandma had loved more than any other place on earth, the weight of her unwavering love settling soft over my chest after days of crippling grief over being locked out of her deathbed. The quiet, bittersweet relief mixing in with the lingering heartache of being disowned by my own parents out of jealousy over her final estate choices. She knew they'd bar me from saying goodbye, I whispered, staring down at the weathered wooden porch planks beneath my sneakers. She could feel how little they cared about her beyond her money, how desperate they were to keep me away so they could manipulate her last wishes without anyone there to witness their greed. Attorney Mercer nodded slow, leaning his elbows against the deck rail beside me to gaze out at the lake's tree line lined with golden autumn maple trees. She wrote multiple witness statements detailing every time they pressured her for cash transfers, every hospital visit they cut short to attend social events, every cruel comment they made about you behind her back. All those documents are sealed alongside the trust paperwork as protective evidence if they launch a lengthy litigation battle to harass you over the coming months. By the time I stepped back inside the cottage to grab my coat and prepare to drive back to my downtown apartment, Mom and Dad had already packed a dozen cardboard moving boxes stacked beside the front door, filled with Grandma's antique silverware, designer handbags, and vintage wall art they planned to haul back to their vacation home before sunset that same day, already divvying up her belongings without a single thought to the decades of quiet care I'd given the woman who'd gifted me full financial security hidden entirely from their grasping reach. Jax carried an expensive diamond necklace Grandma had worn every day tucked into his jacket pocket, bragging loud to Dad about how he planned to resell the jewelry online to fund a cross-country road trip with his high school friends. Oblivious to every sacrifice Eleanor had made to build the fortune his parents were greedily hoarding for his frivolous teenage whims. I didn't pause to exchange a single goodbye word with any of them as I slipped out the cottage's front door and walked back toward my sedan parked at the far end of the gravel driveway, the security guard still loitering by the porch steps, watching my parents haul armfuls of Grandma's heirlooms out to their SUVs, without lifting a finger to assist me in any capacity whatsoever. The drive back to my downtown studio unfolded in a strange, quiet haze of conflicting emotion, crippling sorrow over missing Grandma's final breath, raw anger at my parents' cold-hearted decision to ban me from her deathbed out of unbridled greed, and a fragile, grateful warmth blooming deep in my chest knowing she'd spent years secretly building a safe, stable future for me that no amount of their petty litigation or slanderous rumors could ever take away. Over the weeks following the will reading, Mom and Dad followed through on every empty threat they'd shouted inside Grandma's Lake Cottage great room that afternoon. They reached out to every mutual friend, country club acquaintance, and local business partner they shared with me to spread fabricated lies claiming I'd emotionally manipulated a vulnerable dying elderly woman into gifting me millions of dollars through illegal elder financial exploitation, painting me as a cruel, gold-digging granddaughter who'd intentionally cut them out of Grandma's final hours to steal her hidden trust assets. Multiple former family friends reached out to me privately to repeat the slanderous stories my parents were circulating around town, expressing shock over their blatant dishonesty. Once I shared scanned copies of Grandma's medical cognitive assessments and bank records proving I'd never accepted a single monetary gift from her during her lengthy heart illness. Dad hired 3 separate probate litigation firms to file contested court motions attempting to seize the irrevocable trust's assets, every single legal filing tossed out within 48 hours by the local probate judge once Attorney Mercer submitted Eleanor's signed trust founding documents, medical competency reports, and witness testimonies to the court clerk's office. Each dismissed lawsuit cost Dad tens of thousands of dollars in non-refundable attorney retainers he'd pulled straight from Grandma's inherited stock dividend payouts, draining large chunks of the portfolio he'd spent years begging her to sign over to his joint accounts with Mom. Their financial losses only fueled their bitter resentment toward me further. They cut off all minimal casual contact entirely, blocked my phone number, and every social media profile I owned, sent lengthy anonymous hate mail to my studio apartment mailbox every other day filled with cruel accusations and threats to ruin my personal and professional reputation permanently. I stopped opening their unmarked hostile envelopes after the 3rd week, tossing every handwritten hateful letter straight into my apartment building's trash compactor, without reading a single line of the vicious, jealous vitriol scrawled across the paper pages. Aunt Clara remained the only blood relative who stayed in consistent contact with me throughout the drawn-out probate court proceedings, sending regular text updates detailing Mom and Dad's endless fights over splitting Grandma's Lake Cottage rental profits, Jax's reckless overspending of the college fund Grandma had mandated for his education, and the dozens of expensive country club, social events they hosted using Grandma's prepaid funeral and estate funds to parade their newly inherited wealth in front of their wealthy social circle every single weekend. She visited my downtown condo once the trust's interim maintenance stipends cleared into my personal bank account, bringing a weathered old photo album full of candid snapshots Grandma had taken of us over the years, sitting cross-legged on my brand-new trust-funded living room couch to cry with me over the unfair reality that blood family could discard you so easily over money and petty generational grudges. Eleanor knew exactly how this would play out, Clara told me one afternoon, flipping through the album's yellowed pages of summer lake memories. She told me once if she left all her assets to Robert and Margaret outright, without shielding you, they'd disown you the second the funeral ended and pretend you never existed to protect their inheritance. That trust was her only way to guarantee you'd never have to rely on their charity, or beg them for basic financial stability for the rest of your life. Months dragged by as Dad continued filing one frivolous court challenge after another against the irrevocable trust, each motion swiftly dismissed by the presiding probate judge, mounting thousands of dollars in wasted legal fees draining the inherited stock portfolio he'd spent decades coveting from his own mother. Mom grew increasingly bitter, and isolated within their elite social circle as more and more mutual friends uncovered the truth about their fabricated elder abuse slander campaign against me. Many wealthy donors and country club board members pulling their annual sponsorships from Dad's struggling landscaping business once word spread of his unethical attempts to litigate a protected irrevocable trust left solely to his daughter out of petty familial jealousy. Jax's college savings fund rapidly dwindled as Mom and Dad siphoned large chunks of its designated dividend revenue to cover their endless stack of probate attorney bills, forcing them to break the mandatory 50% education clause Grandma had written into the primary will they'd sworn to uphold during the estate reading proceedings. By the time my 25th birthday arrived the following autumn, the probate court had formally closed all lingering contested litigation tied to Grandma's estate. Every last one of my parents' legal challenges fully dismissed with official court orders barring them from filing any future motions against the trust's asset holdings under penalty of substantial civil fines. Attorney Mercer coordinated the full legal transfer of the downtown condo's property deed and vintage sports car title into my legal name the morning of my birthday, handing over all keys and official ownership paperwork at a quiet private meeting inside his law firm's conference room. No sign of Mom or Dad anywhere in sight. They'd refused to acknowledge the milestone entirely, sending 0 birthday cards, calls, or gifts despite knowing the date marked Grandma's trust's full asset release. Timeline for me. That evening I drove the trust-funded sports car out to Grandma's abandoned lake cottage, the property fully empty now that Mom and Dad had stripped every piece of her personal furniture and heirlooms to furnish their vacation home months prior, leaving only the bare wooden wall frames and stone fireplace she'd built by hand decades ago sitting silent beneath the vaulted ceiling. I sat alone on the weathered back porch deck overlooking the glassy autumn lake where we'd spent hundreds of summer afternoons together, clutching the crumpled childhood swing photograph I'd carried in my jacket pocket the day I'd been locked out of her deathbed at the hospital. Quiet tears sliding down my cheeks as I whispered a soft thank you out into the crisp lake breeze for the quiet, selfless protection she'd spent years secretly building just for me. I'd lost my parents to greed and bitter resentment over an inheritance they'd never been entitled to covet, barred from holding my grandmother's hand during her final breaths, erased from every family memory my mother and father chose to publicly share with their wealthy social circle. But Grandma had kept her promise all those months prior, when she'd leaned in close beside her hospital bed and told me she'd never let them leave me defenseless once she was gone. The $2 million trust, fully paid off downtown condo, and quiet peace of mind that came with knowing I'd never need to beg my toxic blood relatives for financial support stood as her permanent, unshakable legacy, a stark counterpoint to the hollow, bitter fortune Mom and Dad hoarded only to waste on endless legal battles and their son's reckless teenage spending sprees. As the sun dipped low over the maple tree line ringing the lake, painting the water in soft burnt orange and rose gold autumn hues, I folded the tattered swing photograph back into my blazer pocket and climbed into my new sports car to drive back to my safe, quiet downtown condo, fully aware that while my birth family had chosen greed over unconditional love, Grandma's enduring devotion would carry me through every lonely, grief-stricken day ahead for the rest of my life. No amount of empty threats, frivolous lawsuits, or slanderous gossip my parents spread across the city could ever undo the quiet, careful security she'd crafted to shield me from their cruelty the second she knew they planned to lock me away from her deathbed and steal every last trace of her hard-earned fortune for themselves. The line Grandma had written in her sealed estate letter echoed soft in my head on every mile of the drive home. They may take the house, the stocks, and the jewelry they've spent years coveting, but you will never lose the safety I built for the only person who ever loved me without demanding a financial reward in return. It was the truth I'd carry with me forever, etched permanently alongside every warm, precious memory of the grandmother who'd chosen me over her own son and daughter-in-law when greed tore our entire blood family irreparably apart.